thought we'll start with the story. There was a man who came to the rabbi one day in a shtetl in Eastern Europe, and he says, "Rabbi, what do I do? I've got, thank God, my daughter is soon getting married, and I promised 100,000 ruble dowry. And I just simply don't have the money. There's no way. I see no way of me finding this money. What do I do?" The rabbi says to him, "Look, why don't you just, how much do you have so far? What do you have so far?" He says, 50,000. Says, "Well, why don't you give the 50,000 now, and then you'll say, here's 50,000, and then the rest I'll give in the coming months. I'll work it out. I don't quite have it yet, but I'll give it as soon as possible." So he says, "Rabbi, the problem is that 50,000 that I have is what I already told them. That 50,000 that I arranged is the 50,000 that I'll give in a few months." He actually had nothing. So we often, with whether it's financial or social or religious, in whatever area, we often have different commitments. And often once it gets to the crux of the matter, it's actually difficult to keep. There was an Israeli prime minister who made an agreement. He had a certain conditions, certain understanding of the goals of the government that he would lead. And then later on, he wasn't keeping those conditions. And a journalist asked, "What's going on? You said that this is what you're trying to do. You're not doing it." He said, "Yeah, I accepted this agreement, but I didn't accept to keep the agreement." So we're going to talk about commitments today. And we're going to do that through the lens of a surprising incident in our parsha, where Yaakov seems to go against a mitzvah of the Torah. He does not seem to be observing marriage the Torah way. And we're going to try to understand why that happened. What was his justification? Why did he do this? Let's begin first with the premise. The premise is we did not start observing the Torah at Mount Sinai. Yes, that's when it became a commandment, but already before that, the Gemara says in Yoma, this is text 1, our Avot and Imahot observed the whole Torah. Rav said that Abraham, our patriarch, fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given, as it is stated, because Abraham hearkened to my voice, he listened to my voice, Hashem's voice, and kept my charge, my mitzvot, my statutes, and my Torahs. And then the Gemara continues, Abraham, our patriarch, fulfilled the entire Torah, even the mitzvah of joining of cooked foods, a rabbinic ordinance instituted later. So Avram was observing all the Torah, and presumably Sarah was, and their children, Yitzchak, and their son Yitzchak, their daughter-in-law Rivka, Yaakov, Rachel, Leah, observed all of the Torah. And we see this actually throughout hinted at least, throughout the first book of the Torah, throughout the book of Bereshit, right? So maybe just think for yourself first of some examples. Anywhere we see that the whole Torah was already observed or by the Avot and Imahot. What do you think? David, you normally got something to say, or who do we have? Where do we see that our forefathers already kept the whole Torah before it was given? So I'll tell you one that I said we discussed this Shabbat afternoon at Hamayan a few weeks ago, that Abraham served the angels first dairy food and then meat food. Why was that the order? because you can have dairy before meat without a weight. Some have a short wait or a wait of an hour, but the basic halacha is you just wash out your mouth, you can have meat right afterwards. Whereas the other way around, you can't. So Avram first fed them milk, and then first whatever it was, yogurt or cream or whatever, and then meat. We see this in a number of other places in the Torah as well. We see that when Yosef is abducted and sold as a slave into Egypt, and then eventually he becomes the viceroy, he sends a hint back to his father. The hint is, remember what we studied last. The very last section of Torah that they had studied before Yosef got abducted was the passage of Eglah Rufa, which discusses what happens actually if a visitor gets killed, gets murdered while traveling through your city, and how there's a certain process of atonement for not looking after the guest better. It's interesting that was what Yosef was studying, and some commentaries mention this. He was studying the laws of how to atone for not looking after the stranger properly when the stranger gets killed on the way. And what happens to Yosef right afterwards? He gets abducted, almost killed on the way. And although he's a brother, but he's like a stranger to his brothers in some ways. By the way, do you know what they found in the which book they found by the bedside table? They found a few books. They found, I think, some Torah books as well. But one of the books on the bedside table, unfortunately, in the Chabad house of Mumbai, India, right, when they killed they murdered 6 people there, including the couple who were the shluchim there. When was it? It was about, what is it? It was 10 years ago or something?
2008.
2008. So, yeah. So, one of the books they had on the bedside table there, apparently was a book on security and on sort of, keeping safe in times of terror and that type of thing.
Oh my gosh.
Like, in other words, they were reading up on the topic. Yeah. Anyways, so Yosef was learning about the halachas of Eglah Rufa. What happens if a traveler gets attacked while on the way? Now, we also find the Gemara says that the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov established the 3 tefillot, the morning prayer Shachrit, the afternoon Mincha, and the evening Mariv, and that's hinted to in the Torah as well. We also have the Medrash that Rashi quotes about Rivka, that why was Yitzchak comforted? How was Yitzchak comforted by Rivka? There were a number of special things that happened to Sarah, special miracles that happened to Sarah associated with different mitzvot that she observed. And Rivka observed those same mitzvot and had the same miracles as well. And one of them was Shabbos candles. So we see again this idea that the patriarchs and matriarchs observed the Torah. Rashi says this clearly. Rashi says, and this is text 2, all 6:13. He says, another explanation, Garti, it said, Yaakov says, I lived with Lavan. Garti, I lived, has the numerical value of 613. That is to say, I lived with the wicked Lavan, but I kept the 613 commandments, and I did not learn from his evil deeds. So again, we see that Yaakov, not just Avram, but Yaakov observed the entire Torah. And therefore the question is, if he observed the whole Torah, how can he marry 2 sisters? It's not allowed. The Torah does not allow marrying 2 sisters. Just to note, by the way, that although originally there was polygamy, but it was not advised already for a very long time. But even actually we see in Tanakh, it's relatively rare. Some of the famous people did it, but if you look throughout the whole Tanakh, it's relatively rare to have someone married to more than one wife. And so, yeah. Anyway, but either way, one thing that you can't do, one thing that was always prohibited was marrying two sisters, and that was the one. The reason is, at least the simple reason, Rashi says, and this is text. I'll read text 3 and text 3b. First of all, the pasuk, the verse says, "And you shall not take a woman with her sister in marriage as rivals in her lifetime." So Rashi says, for this would cause each sister to become a rival to the other one. It's bad to create a situation where there will be tension between sisters. So then the question is, if this is not allowed, if you're not allowed to marry two sisters, then how did Yaakov do it? The glaring question. I've got it in Hebrew and English. The Ramban asks it and others. He says, Al das shaya Avram mekaymes Torah. If Avram and his descendants observe the Torah, yesh lishel, we can ask, Eich nasa Yaakov shtei achayos. How did Yaakov marry two sisters? Now, the question then becomes, what should Yaakov do? Who should he, he married Leah without knowing. Maybe he should divorce Leah and marry Rachel. Or maybe he should not marry Rachel. He's already married to Leah. Leave it at that. So I'd like to suggest, now that you might say, well, who was his favorite? Who did he originally want to marry? He wanted to marry Rachel. So therefore, he should marry Rachel because that was his original love. But on the other hand, it seems that Leah was also, it was meant to be that Leah was also destined for him. And I'll show you one place where we see a hint that Leah is destined for Yaakov as well.
Also, halachically, I don't think it helps because the halacha is you're not allowed to marry two sisters in their lifetime because of rivalry. You can't divorce one sister and then marry another while the second one is still alive.
That's a good point. That's a good point. The pasuk says b'chayeha while she's alive. However, you could be right. However, there are different opinions whether Yaakov was actually married to Leah after the first night. If you marry someone and you think you're marrying someone and it's actually someone else, are you halachically married? No.
Well, yeah, there's an honest there.
No, it's more than an honest. It's actually...
Yeah, you didn't know. Yes, you didn't know.
Honest is when you do something, but it was... if you get forced to marry someone, that's one question. This question is you actually didn't know who you intended someone else. And the halacha there is that if you intend to marry someone and it's actually someone else under the veil, so to speak, or the same, by the way, with a divorce. If someone if the scribe writes a divorce, having in mind one person, and then someone else uses that divorce, the divorce document is invalid. It has to be written for the person. So let's say you have two people. The Gemara discusses if you have two people with the same name, Yosef ben Shimon. So if the scribe writes it for one of these and it's actually a different one, it's invalid, even though they have the same name. The same thing with marriage. It wouldn't be a valid marriage. And some say actually that Yaakov was not married to Leah after the first night, and the next day he would have got married to her. Others say, well, because Yaakov knew that Lavan was a trickster, he had in mind that in case this is not really Rachel, it's really Leah, I'm still getting married. And therefore the marriage was, it was considered halachically a marriage. But yeah, you're right. It possibly wouldn't have been, if they were married, then perhaps he couldn't have divorced her and then married Rachel. But on the other hand, there's also...
Potentially, when he confronts Lavan in the morning, potentially he might have had that in mind. But Lavan says to him, well, it's all your fault because you took over Esav's destiny. And so what am I supposed to do? I've got two daughters. One was supposed to marry Yaakov, one was supposed to marry Esav. Because you stole his bracha, he's not now part of the fold. What do you expect me to do?
Okay, nice. So that's how some interpret when he says we've got to give the older one before the younger one because now both are for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Incidentally, on the question of that you came in with on the milk and meat, there's another story which actually, when somebody told it to me, I thought it was a joke, but it's actually in Midrash Tehillim. That we know the famous story that when God was going to give us the Torah, the angel said, "We'll take it."
Right.
And he said, no, etc., etc. Well, I thought this was a joke, but it actually is a Midrash in Midrash Tehillim that God says to them, "What? You say you're going to keep the Torah? I let you out of my sight for 5 minutes to go to visit Abraham, and you start eating milk and meat."
That's true. Yeah, that's the opposite point. That's saying that they didn't do right.
Yes. And there are other explanations as to what it meant when Yaakov saw the Agalot, why his spirit revived, not only.
Oh, yeah. Look, I mean, if you would read the pasuk simply, I'm sure, let's say Rashbam, those who keep the text as close to literal as possible wouldn't interpret it that way. Yes, but Rashi adds in a bit of more midrash than some of the others. Okay, so either way, we've got a hint in the pasuk that Yaakov and Leah somehow belong together. First, let's read here. This is in text. Let's read text 5, where Yaakov meets Rachel for the first time, and he introduces himself, and he says, "Vayaged Yaakov leRachel." Yaakov tells Rachel, "Ki achi aviyahu." I am the brother of your father, v'chi ven Rivkahu, and I am the son of Rivka. Vataretz vatagid lavia, and then Rachel ran to her father to tell him the news that a cousin has arrived. Now, the Gemara says this is surprising. The Gemara asks, wait a sec, Yaakov was not Lavan's brother. This is in text 5b. The Gemara asks, but isn't he the son of her father's sister? He's not Lavan's brother. He's Lavan's nephew. Why did he say that he was her father's brother? Rather, Yaakov and Rachel had the following exchange. Yaakov said to Rachel, "Will you marry me?" This was love at first sight. He meets her and he says, "Will you marry me?" Rachel said to him, "Yes, but my father is a deceitful person, and you cannot defeat him." So Yaakov said to her, "What is his method of deceit of which I need to be aware?" Rachel said to him, "I have a sister who is older than me, and he will not marry me off before he marries her off, even if he promises that he will do so." Yaakov said to her, "I am his brother, i.e. equal in deceit. He will not be able to deceive me." This is why Yaakov said that he was her father's brother, meaning I'm capable of defending myself against your father's deceit. I am his equal. Therefore, to counter Laban's deceit, Yaakov gave Rachel secret signs to prove to him that she was the one marrying him. Now, what they were worried about actually happened. Let's read on. When Laban's associates were bringing Leah up to the wedding canopy to marry Yaakov, Rachel thought, now my sister will be humiliated. When Yaakov discovers that she is the one marrying him, when Yaakov discovers that it's Leah, not Rachel, Leah will be embarrassed. Therefore, Rachel gave the signs to Leah. And this is as it is written, and it came to pass in the morning, and behold, it was Leah. The verse is difficult, as by inference, should one derive that at night until now she was not Leah? Rather, through the signs that Yaakov gave to Rachel and that she gave to Leah, he didn't know it was she until that morning. Okay. So the Gemara says that Yaakov knew that Lavan was a trickster, and he planned a way to get past the tricks by creating a password, right? He knew that he wouldn't. How did the whole thing happen? right? They were getting married at night, and she was wearing a veil for the wedding ceremony. And then afterwards, they're going into a dark room, a dark bedroom, and he couldn't see her. Some Midrashim even add that Rachel was hiding out somewhere under the bed there or somewhere, and therefore even the voice was actually Rachel's voice. Besides that, so some Midrashim say that this was Friday night, and if he was keeping Shabbos, they couldn't turn on the lights. And besides that, this wasn't right after he met Rachel. It was 7 years later. So you could argue, I don't know, were they spending a lot of time together the whole time or not? Probably yes, possibly not. But besides that, perhaps the main point is also some Midrashim say that Rachel and Leah were twins, and therefore possibly they looked very similar. And in the dark, you could imagine confusion happening. Okay, so now, what was the sign? This is very interesting. Das Akanim, which is written by the Tosaphists, the same ones who wrote Tosfos, which is one of the main commentaries on Gemara after Rashi, and they also, the same academy, the French Academy of Tosafot, also wrote Das Akanim, and they say that what was the sign? The Medrash says that Rachel had a secret sign. She was going to whisper a few words, and then Yaakov would know it's her. What were those words? Was it abracadabra? So Das Akanim says that the sign was Nida, Chala, and Hadlaka Taner. Nida, Chala, and Shabbos candles, 3 mitzvot associated with women. Family purity, then Chala is to separate the piece of the dough for the Kohen, and lighting Shabbos candles. That was actually the password, if you will. Wow. I just always, love to note, the later Das Akanim was written by the Tosaphists of France. You know that the students of the Tosaphists, they discussed all of these different questions and contradictions between different passages of Talmud. Tosfos is basically, most of Tosfos is finding contradictions between different passages and answering how they fit together, which is a prerequisite for working out halacha. In order to come to a final ruling, you have to compare all the different factors, all the different sources, and put them together as find how they all work together. The later Tosafists did not have a Gemara. So while they were analyzing Gemara, they were doing it by heart. They didn't actually have a Gemara to look in because the French burnt all the Gemaras. And to learn Tosfos with a Gemara is complicated enough. Imagine if you were in a yeshiva of comparing 2 different Gemaras, neither of which you ever saw because they had all been burnt. Anyway. Now, so one of the things, so either way, so Rachel is worried the whole time that there's going to be a trick. Yaakov promises her it's going to be fine. I'm going to make a secret password. And then Lavan takes Leah anyway to get married to Yaakov. And then Rachel feels bad for it, gives over the secret words, Nida, Chala, Shabbos candles, and Leah gets married. This always stayed on Yaakov's conscience in some way. And if you feel like you've regretted something for a year and it's a long time, or even 10 years or 20 years and it's a long time, listen to this. I'll just say it in my own words, but the Gemara in Psachim, this is text 6, says that when Mashiach comes, there's going to be this big feast, the righteous. And at the end of the feast, you always have to have someone to lead the benching. So the celebrants will say, Abraham.
I just want something scanned in.
Yes, there's somebody who's not mute.
Okay, let's. Okay.
If we all mute our phones, if we all mute, then we can hear you. There won't be the background noise, and you can always unmute us as well as we can do ourselves.
Let me see if I can.
Just if everyone mutes his or her own device, there won't be
Okay.
any background noise.
I thought I was muted.
No worries. So I'll just answer. Tzipi typed a question here. How do we know that well, I don't really have an answer. How do we know that those three words are the sign? I don't know. I'm not sure if it was a tradition or if it was some sort of divine inspiration. I'm not sure what the answer is. Somehow Dasakanim says those were the three words of the password, but I'm not sure. But either way, we need to find someone to lead the benching. So what happens? Of course, they ask Avram Avinu, please, b'chavod, can you lead the benching and the mezuman? And what does Avram say? Oh no, I'm not suitable. Avram says, I can't, because look who I produced. Yishmael comes from me. Then they ask Yitzchak, here, please, take the cup of wine and lead the benching. He says, no, Esav came from me. I can't lead the benching. Not right. Then they say, Yitzchak says to Yaakov, no, my son, you lead the benching. Yaakov says, no, I married two sisters, Rachel and Leah, in their lifetime, which the Torah forbids. I can't lead the benching. And so it goes on. They say to Moshe, you lead the benching. He says, no, I never entered Eretz Yisrael. I wasn't even buried in Eretz Yisrael. Then Yeshua, no, I can't. Finally, it gets to Dovid, to King David HaMelech. And he says, yes, I will recite the blessing. And he actually will be the one to lead the benching. So we see that Yaakov, even when Mashiach comes, he'll still be thinking, I did something wrong. I married two sisters. We also find this throughout the 22 years. And this is always, when something goes wrong and people blame themselves. And in general, it's not a good thing, because it's paralyzing. But Yaakov blamed himself throughout the whole time that his son Yosef was missing. And he always thought, maybe I did something wrong, that I married two sisters. This is text 7. It says, this is from the Medrash, Yalkut Shimoni, that that when Yosef was sold, Yaakov was crying and mourning, the whole 22 years. He was saying, Oili, woe is to me. Shemon is chayavti, maybe this is my fault. That I married two sisters, which is a sin, and that's why this happened to me. Besides the fact that the jealousy between Yosef and his brothers was actually simply a continuation from Yaakov marrying two sisters. His favorite was Yosef, who was the oldest son of Rachel. And therefore that caused jealousy. And then Yosef ends up getting sold by his brothers. But either way, Yaakov is worried about the sin. I married two sisters and therefore this happened to me. Okay. I'm itching for the answer, but I'll just say a little outside that the Torah, Hebrew is normally easy to read. Yeah? Anyone who hasn't learned it, it's not that hard. Why? Because it's phonetic. In English is complicated to learn. But Hebrew, once you know what all the sound that the letters make, that the nukodot make, it's easy. However, in the Torah, there is from time to time a word which you don't read as it is written. And that's called, in Hebrew, there's kri and ksiv. There's the way it's written and the way it's read. So here we have an example of that. When Yaakov wakes up in the morning and it's Leah, the Torah doesn't say v'hine he Leah with a yud. It spells it with a vav. It doesn't say behold she was Leah. It's written as and behold he was Leah. Why? because in some way Yaakov was meant for Leah. Just as Leah had tricked Yaakov, Yaakov had tricked his father Yitzchak and tricked to get the blessings in some way. So and not only that, once Yaakov took on those blessings, as David said earlier, he was destined now for Leah. And that's why perhaps the Torah uses the he over here with the vav, which normally is read as he, not she, because Yaakov was meant for Leah. It's not just the surprise was Leah, but Yaakov is destined for Leah. And in some way, Yaakov is now the Bechor, who's destined for the older sister, and therefore he shouldn't divorce Leah. But why did he marry Rachel? He shouldn't have done it. It's against the Torah. So the Ramban says something very interesting. You know, there's a big debate. Halachically, do we have to, or is there a biblical mitzvah to live in Israel? Is there? Anyone who wants to be an Orthodox Jew, is there a biblical mitzvah to live in Israel?
Ramban versus Rambam.
So there's the famous debate between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam says no. There's always going to be analysis in each opinion. But simply the Rambam says no, and the Ramban simply says yes. By the way, even something that's a mitzvah doesn't mean it's an obligation. There are many things that are a mitzvah but are not an obligation. But still, at least if you do it, according to the Ramban, if you live in Israel, you are doing a biblical mitzvah. Whereas according to the Rambam, you're not. Although you're not allowed, although if you are there already, even the Rambam says you shouldn't leave.
The Rambam doesn't say it's not a mitzvah. He just fails to list it as a separate Tariag mitzvah. And others would suggest that he intended it to be included in other places. He never said it's not a mitzvah.
Yeah, look, that some say that. I mean, who am I to argue with great people who say it? But I mean, simply, it's not one of the 613 according to the Rambam. Yeah. Yes, some say that it's a general mitzvah, or it's by the way, even according to the Ramban, there's a debate whether it's a mitzvah now, because some say it's only a mitzvah if you are conquering the lands under it, and some add even more under a king and whatever else, other conditions with the prophet. But either way, simply according to the Rambam, it's not, and Ramban, yes. But yes, some disagree with that as well. But according to the Ramban certainly was very big in living in Eretz Yisrael. He himself made Aliyah in old age, although he did it when he was basically chased out of Spain for winning a debate against the Christian or new Christian missionary. Basically, if he would have lost, then they would have probably forced the Jews to convert. If he would win, then he gets in trouble for disparaging Christianity. It was a no-win situation. But either way, after that debate, he left and moved to Israel. And the Ramban says that the mitzvahs that we do now are mere shadows of the mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, he says, he takes it to the degree, nowadays we still keep the mitzvah even in the diaspora. But in the times of the patriarchs and matriarchs, we did not keep the mitzvahs if we were out of Israel. So he says, sure, did Avram keep the mitzvahs? Sure, but in Israel. Did Yaakov keep the mitzvahs? Sure, but in Israel. Where did he marry two sisters? In Haran, out of Israel, and therefore that's allowed. And sadly, what actually happens? As they're coming back to Israel, Rachel passes away right as they enter Israel. Why? Because somehow the land wasn't able to hold this forbidden marriage. And therefore, once he's back in Israel, it just can't be that they're married, two sisters both married to the same man, and that's when Rachel passes away. So either way, we need a understand it, analyze it for another time. But Ramban's answer is that Yaakov did not observe the Torah out of Israel, and therefore he was allowed to marry two sisters. A second answer. This is from the Mishnah Lamelech. He wrote a sefer called Parashat Drachim, and in it he discusses at length. There's a spelling mistake there. But he discusses at length, were the Avot Noahides who accepted an extra... He discusses, were the patriarchs and matriarchs considered Noahides, just that they kept the 613 mitzvahs, or were they considered full-fledged halachic Jews? Right? That's his question. Were they Noahides who were extra strict, or were they Jews? I have an acquaintance who's not Jewish, but he lives in rural Victoria, hours away from here, and he observes kosher as he understands it. He has Hasidic music and Jewish music in general always playing in his house. He often wears a kippah. He when he wanted to find a wife, he was having trouble getting married. He went to the kotel to pray, and then he found his wife right afterwards. But either way, so were the Avot like also non-Jews, Noahides, but they just accepted the mitzvot, or were they actually halachically Jewish? If they were converts, it says that when someone converts, they are like a newborn. So then we can argue that if Rachel and Leah both converted, now they're both newborns. So they're not sisters anymore halachically, and therefore they can both marry Yaakov. That's the second answer. Maybe they weren't halachically sisters because they were both newborns. They'd just been born again, and therefore they can marry Yaakov. Now, by the way, nowadays, even converts, if you we never allow converts to do something after they're Jewish that they wouldn't have been allowed before they were Jewish. But still, at least biblically, we can argue that they were not considered halachically related in the sense that they should be prohibited from marrying the same person. That's a possible second answer. Although we find in the Torah that when Hashem talks to Abraham, he says, your father, talking about Terach. So we see that it seems that as much as they observe the Torah, they're born again, they're reborn, all very nice, but they were still considered halachically related. Okay, now I want to give a third and final answer, but perhaps first a story. This is a story that with a fellow called Yaakov Zilberstein. And this Yaakov is a man in his 90s living in Israel, and he has, as far as I know, I haven't heard of anyone else, he has the terrible distinction of being one of the only survivors who was in concentration camps for 6 years. Like, in other words, 1939, September, October 1939, right from the beginning of the war until liberation in 1945. He was right at the beginning of the war. He lived in Poland, somewhere close to the German border. The Germans conquered his town right away, and it was dangerous to go out. And his father looked more identifiably Jewish, and he had a beard and everything yarmulke. And they asked the son, Yaakov, you're young, you're not as identifiable without a beard, and can you go out and buy some, whatever it was, some challah, some bread? And he goes out and he gets grabbed by Nazis and sent straight to Buchenwald, which had already opened before the war. And then he's there for 3 years, and he has, of course, terrible times, but survives. And then he's sent to Auschwitz for 3 years. He was close to dying a few times. One time he was hanged. He was suspected of being part of a conspiracy to rebel against the Nazis, and he was hanged by his feet. And then someone, he was already unconscious, and then someone like cut the rope, let him down. Doesn't know who or what. And then another time he was actually sent to the gas chambers. He was already in the gas chambers, and a Nazi sees him and says, you still look strong and healthy. Get out. He grabbed him and said, get out of here. You still have some work in you before we kill you. He took him out. And he survived the whole war. But afterwards, and years later, he was asked like about, it's the most, it was horrific, but also incredible that he survived. And he said that at difficult times throughout, and even when he's going on the death march at the end, he was thinking, I made a commitment to someone. I made a commitment. There was someone else there that he met right in 1939. He was already dying, and someone else was in Buchenwald with him, 1939, and he was dying. And he said, before I pass away, I want you to make 2 commitments to me. Number 1, you're young, you're strong, you're going to survive. Promise that you'll tell the world what happened here. And number 2, he says, tell my family that I love them, and tell them when and where I passed away. And this Zilberstein, at times when he wanted to give up, he says, wait a sec, I have a commitment. I'm not allowed to die now. I made a commitment to this guy. I made a commitment to Rabinowitz. I've got to survive. And this commitment helped him survive right through the war. After the war, he actually, in later years, he joined the board of directors of Yad Vashem, and many years later, he didn't find Rabinowitz's children, but he did find Rabinowitz's grandson, and told him what happened. The message from his grandfather. So, in this vein, the Rebbe gives a third answer to this question. He says, yes, it's all very nice to keep extra hidurim, extra stringencies, to go beyond the letter of the law. At the time, the Noahites, they're allowed to marry 2 sisters. It's only for the Jewish people. The Torah does not allow it. Yaakov wanted to be extra strict and not marry 2 sisters. But that doesn't come at the expense of someone else's dignity. It doesn't come at the expense of the commitment that he made to someone else. And therefore, since he had committed to Leah and he had committed to Rachel early on, he couldn't break either commitment. And what he had to do is break his hidur. You can't go beyond the letter of the law at someone else's expense. Like, the lady who said, I'm recounted about how careful she is with Pesach, and she's cleaning this and that, and very far beyond the letter of the law. And then the response was that you have to remember 2 things. Number 1, that dirt is not chametz, and number 2, that your children are not the korban Pesach. Right? So, in other words, Yaakov, you're going beyond the letter of the law. You're doing wonderful things. But if what you're doing is hurting someone else, then step back. Maybe that's not appropriate right now. And therefore, Yaakov abstained from his regular practice of keeping all 613 mitzvot in order to do what is more important, to keep his commitments and be a mensch to others. And this message is actually the very first thing we're asked, after 120, we go up and we're asked right at the beginning, there's the Talmud relates 6 questions were asked in heaven. And I've got them in text 12, at least the first 4 of them. When a person passes away, the heavenly court asks, did you deal honestly? Then did you set time to learn Torah? Did you occupy yourself with being fruitful, having children? Did you yearn for the redemption? So the very first question is, did you deal honestly? Why? Because first of all, be a mensch. Then we'll get on to your Jewish obligations. But first, your human obligations. Be honest. Keep your commitments. And that is why, that's a third reason why Yaakov married Rachel, because he had committed to her, and stayed with Leah as well. He had committed to her. Keep worrying about other people's dignity before his bonus mitzvah or spiritual elevation. Anyway, in short, why did Yaakov marry Rachel, even though the Torah prohibits marrying two sisters? Number one, he did it out of Israel. That's what the Ramban answers. Number two, perhaps Rachel and Leah were born again, and therefore they weren't halachically considered sisters. And number three, don't take on an added stringency at someone else's expense and at the expense of keeping your commitments to them. Anyway, any question, comments? We're going to conclude. What do we say?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just want to ask you about Rachel passing away on the way to Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah.
So there's this whole thing that's about calling, what's that pasuk about Rachel crying for her children?
Yes. Yeah. Look, I'm uncomfortable, of course, with that being what I had in tonight's Shiur being the whole story. Of course, it's not. Rachel is praised, and it seems like in some way she almost wanted to pass away here, and then she would be the one whose prayers for the Jewish people would be accepted when, the rest of our forefathers, patriarchs and matriarchs, would not be accepted. She was buried along the road into exile. Yes. Yeah, so in other words, it's not like just a bad thing, and obviously this is not the whole story. Yeah.
Right. So she died in childbirth, right?
Right. She passed away in childbirth. Yeah.
Yeah.